Sure. Why don't we go ahead
Sure.
and start. I'm Carol Runyon. I'm Director of Program for Injury Prevention Education and Research called Piper in the School of Public Health. And we try to offer a monthly seminar. This is the first for this year. We want you to stay tuned, and that's part of why I'm sending the form around, so that there are other topics that interest you. Or if you have suggestions of topics that you'd like us to try and cover, or if you want to give a seminar, we welcome suggestions. Today's seminar, Dr. Daniel Goldberg is our presenter, and I'm pleased to say this is a joint program with the Center for Bioethics and Humanities here on campus.
Got a little closer.
Get closer to the mic.
Yeah.
Sorry. I didn't know where the mic was. So Daniel Goldberg is an associate professor here. He's got appointments. He's based at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, and also has appointments in family medicine and in epidemiology. I think those are the only ones at the moment. Prior to coming here, he was at the East Carolina University, and before that has been a trial lawyer and served in a number of capacities. He has a bachelor's from Wesleyan University, a JD from University of Houston Law Center, and a PhD in medical humanities from the University of Texas, where he focused on both history of public health and medicine as well as ethical issues. So it's a real pleasure to have him here. I've had him speak in my class, and I know he's an exciting speaker and welcomes conversation, debate, discussion. So let's get after it, as Chris Cuomo says.
Okay. Thanks, Dr.
I know we are competing with the Kavanaugh hearings, but this is being taped, so you can tell others that it will be available within a week or so on our website.
On Piper's website.
On Piper's website.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Runyon, and we're small but mighty, so don't hold questions to the end. We can chat as we go along, okay? So, again, I have a different background than pretty much anybody here at Anschutz. So I'm trained as a lawyer, and I'm a historian, and I'm a bioethicist. Almost all of my interest in my work is in public and population health, so I'm really a public health person, and that's part of the reason I'm excited to be here. So I've been working on the topic of traumatic brain injury and collision sports for probably about a decade. I fell into it quite by accident. I had an advisor in graduate school who was really interested in brain and sort of neuro issues and ethics, and he said, maybe you should write something about this. This was back in 2007, before all the stuff with the National Football League in the U.S. completely blew up, and I was like, oh, okay. I was this dutiful graduate student who just said, oh, my advisor tells me to do that, I'll do that. And so I've been sort of working on it ever since. So I take a little bit of a different perspective to thinking about collision sports and traumatic brain injury than I think a lot of other people working in this space. I like to joke that it took me 10 years and 2 postgraduate degrees to realize I should have been a historian all along. So I'm not really joking. So I don't get a real chance to do a lot of professional history. So what I often try to do is ask us when we start to think about ethics and law and policy to think historically for a minute. We're not going to do history, but we're going to think historically. And then I think there are a number of really important and interesting observations that come out of that when we do that. Okay, so the first thing I do is I think about what are some of these frameworks. And the framework I often use, especially when we start to talk about collision sports and traumatic brain injury, is something called deep play. So there's an anthropologist named Clifford Geertz. He's one of the most famous anthropologists. He's dead now, but he's one of the most famous anthropologists of the 20th century. And one of the things, one of Geertz actually authored one of the most famous essays in anthropological history. The title of this essay, surprising to most people, is Notes on a Balinese Cockfight. And yes, that is actually one of the most influential papers ever published in cultural anthropology. Why? What Geertz said was there are some games that almost every society plays. It's different games in different places, of course. But there are some games that are so important that if we study those games, we can learn almost everything that is deeply important about a given society. So he said he was studying in Bali, and he said, you want to know how Balinese people feel about life, death, right? Birth, suffering, illness, sickness, violence, care, families. He said, if you want to know about any of these things, pay attention to the cockfights, and you will learn. Okay, so he said there are these games that most societies play that are deep play games. And in the U.S., it's pretty obvious. Our deep play games are, we have a couple probably. One of them is, obviously, Tackle football, American tackle football. That's pretty obviously a deep play game. Any other ones? I think baseball probably qualifies as a deep play game. Full disclosure, I love baseball. Okay, so I'm probably biased. What about Argentina? What's their deep play game? Soccer, right? Of course, right? So different societies have different deep play games. They're not always the same. But here in the U.S., of course, one of ours is American tackle football, right? Canada also has a collision sport as a deep play game.
Hockey.
Ice hockey, okay? Right, so you can start to see these things. So they encode very vast and deep meanings for a given society. That's what a deep play game means, right? So when people try to understand, why is this so important? People who aren't football fans, for example, why does this matter? It matters because tackle football is a deep play game in the United States. So you could not care about it at all. You could have no interest in tackle football, no interest in ice hockey if you happen to be Canadian, but it is hugely significant in that given culture and society, right? And tackle football is clearly one of those. Something else that's pretty important, right, is if you notice something about deep play games, many of them, not all of them, tend to involve contact. They tend to involve what Gertz calls violence. They tend to involve violence, okay? Every people, this is actually an epigraph, okay? He puts it right up front at the beginning of his essay. This is the quote: every people, the proverb has it, loves their own form of violence. It's not always true that deep play games are violent collision sports, but they often are, right? The title of the essay in which he wrote this, and he sort of produced these insights, is about a cockfight, which is a pretty violent affair if you've ever seen one or heard of one, right? So a lot of our deep play games involve violence. Think of Rome, right? Think of gladiatorial games, these kinds of things. So it's not always true, but it's very commonly true that our deep play games are often involve collisions and violence, okay? So that's the first framework for thinking about some of these ethical and legal and political issues and talking about collision sports. The next framework, and then we'll get to some of the meat of the issues that I'm going to talk about, is thinking about these things historically. And this is what I often ask interlocutors and colleagues and people who I'm working with to think about these kinds of things. Right? I think to really understand collision sports, and in the US, when I say collision sports, we're principally talking about tackle football. Of course, it's not the only one, but it's a deep play game. And we'll talk about some other sports that raise some of those issues as well, because of course they exist, but more focused on football for some reasons connected to it being a deep play game. When we talk about these things, I think there is a historical script. There is a script, and what do I mean by that, right? I think we have to think about this as a public health historian would. We have to think about regulated industries that are introducing products into the stream of commerce that are hazardous to public and population health, right? If you think about tackle football in the US, it actually qualifies. There is a regulated industry, right? It is introducing a product, it's a commodity, into the stream of commerce. It is selling. Tackle football sells, in case you didn't know, it's big business, right? And we have reason to believe that it is injurious and hazardous to public health, right? So it really fits that bill. So what happens if you start to do this? You start to see that this is an old story. This is not the first time this has happened, right? We can go back 100, maybe 120 years, and we see a number of these kinds of things occurring. We can talk about lead. We can talk mining and asbestos. We can talk about the vinyl industries. We can talk about tobacco, which is a very obvious one, right? We can talk about the pharmaceutical industry. We can talk about, there's a number of them, okay? There's a number of them. And what happens is regulated industries have to deal with the social, political, and legal fallout that comes from efforts to push back against introduction of these injurious products into the stream of commerce. They have to find some way of managing it, right? So that bad things don't happen to their business, which is pretty common, okay? So what they do is they introduce something, a historical script. When I say script, a lot of people think it means like fate or destiny. That's actually not what I mean. What I mean is there's a script which players in these battles over regulatory policy and regulated industries are often following. And the reason they follow it is not because they have to. It's not fate or destiny. They follow it because it works. It works, okay? It is a set of legal, political, and social strategies that representatives of regulated industry, which are highly sophisticated political actors, right, use to achieve their aims. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of those aims might be, okay? And I think the best way of thinking about this is, the best way of titling this is, it's called, the script that I am most interested in and I think is most applicable to thinking about these kinds of issues is called the manufacture of doubt. The manufacture of doubt. Why? Where does this come from? Okay? So it comes from a memorandum that was produced by an internal memorandum that was produced by a very high-level tobacco executive. And it was internal, so it was not meant for our consumption, no pun intended, okay? It was sent to another high-level tobacco executive, and it came out in the tobacco litigation in the 1980s and the early 90s, right? So when the tobacco companies were forced by operation of discovery to produce billions of pages of documents, which, by the way, are still being mined. Their publications appearing on the tobacco litigation several a year, still, at least. This is one of the things that came out of it, and this was pretty damning, as you might imagine, for the tobacco industry, right? And what they said was, as a means of a regulatory strategy, as a political strategy, they said, we are selling doubt. Doubt is our product. Why? What does that mean, right? The idea is the key part of the manufacture of doubt is forestalling what? What does Ford making Pintos not want? What does the tobacco companies not want above all else? What will most injure their commerce would be what?
Class action lawsuit.
Yeah, lawsuits. What's the other thing you really want to avoid? The jackbooted thugs of government, right? Coming along and putting their little thumbs on them, right? The idea is to forestall regulatory action. They don't want more regulations. They don't want more laws. They certainly don't want more litigation, okay? So that's part of it as well. So they forestall these things. How do they do it? They do it by introducing doubt. Doubt as to principally, and we'll talk more about this as we go on, principally as to the causal connections between the exposure to their given product and a public health harm that is resulting from that. Okay? There's lots of other ways that they're trying to do that too. But the key is that they are trying to manufacture doubt. And if they can introduce enough doubt into the public and political spheres, what will they be able to do? They'll be able to create what they call a regulatory vacuum. That's the phrase that legal and political theory scholars usually use. Regulatory vacuum means we don't have a lot of regulations on it. When did we get our first serious regulations of tobacco products? You know? Was it 1960s? No. 1970s? No. 1980s? Late 1980s. Okay? That's when we got our first federal serious attempts to seriously regulate, right? There were some minor restrictions. You couldn't sell tobacco products to someone under the age of 18. That was about the only one, okay? So there's no question that this script works. This is not a hypothetical. This is not me just sort of screaming into the ether. The manufacture of doubt works. It works to achieve those goals that regulated industry typically has. They're not always the same, but most of those goals are to create a regulatory vacuum, to forestall regulatory and policy action that could depress the profits and revenues and injure the stream of commerce. They don't want to do that, okay? So they introduce doubt as a way to say, well, we just don't know enough yet. Maybe when we do, somewhere down the road, then we can talk about laws and policies and public health interventions that we might want to introduce. But we don't need to do that now. We can't do it now because we don't know enough about the connections between this particular exposure and the harm. So in the case of tobacco, David Michaels, who's a public health professor at GW and was former head of OSHA under the Obama administration, he has a book where the title of the book is, this is actually the title of his book, Doubt is Our Product, okay? And what he documents is this: look, if we had introduced the kinds of regulations we have today for the sale and consumption of tobacco products, if we had introduced them in the 1960s, what would have happened to public health? What would we have been able to do? And he said, look, there's no question we would have saved thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people's lives. We would have substantially reduced morbidity and mortality. We don't know exactly for who, that's how statistics works, but we know in aggregate that's exactly what would have happened. So this has very, very serious public health consequences, right? Tobacco is the most obvious example, but there are other examples. The sooner we can implement public health action, the sooner we are able to have a positive effect on morbidity and mortality resulting from those exposures. If we wait, then every day we wait, there are more exposures. And if those exposures cause harm, then every single day, every week, every month, every year, there are more and more harms growing, right? That's why, for example, pharmaceutical companies, and I know this because I did pharmaceutical defense as a lawyer, by the way, right? Pharmaceutical companies actually measure their profits by what unit? What unit of time? Days. Days. Not years. They measure it by the day. So every day, and if you think about how much money pharmaceutical companies actually make, that's a separate talk, by the way, it's days add up, right? You're talking about millions and billions of dollars right? So this is serious things, okay? So this is the historical script that I generally like to say, let's talk about collision sports and traumatic brain injury as part of this idea, as part of the general history of regulated industry, as part of attempts to manufacture doubt. And let's see where we get, okay? So there's a number of ethical issues that people really tend to talk about. For these things, you could have issues of autonomy and informed consent or assent, right? Because most people, when we talk about collision sports and TBI, they want to talk about the National Football League. How many people play professional football? You guys know? About 1,500. How many youths and adolescents play tackle football in the U.S.? Close to 4 million. Okay, so in terms of, right, which is the more vulnerable population is, for almost obvious reasons in terms of injury epidemiology, is going to be youths and adolescents. So it's not that we shouldn't be concerned about the adults, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying if we were to prioritize, we probably want to think a little bit more about the 4 million youths and adolescents playing tackle football than just, right, the adults. So that introduces issues of how old do you have to be to consent, right? What can parents do for their children? We'll talk about those kinds of things. There's big conflicts of interest, issues of justice, and all these kinds of things. So there's a lot to talk about. I am right now focusing on 2 issues in particular, right? Both because I think they're most significant, and then also because I happen to be most interested in them, right? So scholar's privilege, I'll talk about what I'm most interested in, okay? So the first problem that I'm really interested in is conflicts of interest. So I am actually a conflict of interest scholar. It is one of my areas of expertise, so it's convenient for me to just shoehorn it into this particular topic as well. But I actually think it applies. So I think one of my overarching concerns when we talk about conflicts of interest, and they are rampant when we talk about collision sports and TBI, right? I'll talk about what that is and how it is. One of my particular problems with conflicts of interest is I think that we tend to talk about these without a clear understanding of what the cognitive science evidence base suggests for how these kinds of conflicts impact human behavior. And that's what I really want to do. I want to say, well, what does it actually suggest? The best term that you find in the behavioral psychology, the cognitive science literature on these is actually motivated bias. I think that's a better term than conflict of interest is fine. But really what we're talking about when we talk about conflicts of interest is something called motivated bias. We're all humans. We all have biases. Sometimes we have certain kinds of motivations to be biased in different ways. And I think that's the most productive way of thinking about conflicts of interest. Almost every kind of serious conflict of interest in this sphere, in health, professional spheres in general, are about relationships. It's about the relationships we form with others, because those relationships are very, very powerful motivators, as it turns out, of biased behavior. Well, what do I mean by that? So the classic example I usually give is there are almost every health professional society, regardless of what kind of health professional you are, has a rule that you really shouldn't be involved in delivering any kind of treatment to someone who's a family member. Why? Yeah, you can't be objective. The concern is you have a motivation to be biased in ways that are not in the best interests of this particular patient. That's the concern, right? I think that example is also helpful because it has nothing to do with money. Now, as it turns out, money is also a very powerful motivator of human behavior. But the point is that we have motivations to be biased in all sorts of ways, and these depend on our relationships. And yes, those relationships often involve money, but they don't have to. We can still have motivations to be biased. So part of the reason I think this is really important is this is part of the manufacture of doubt. And this is why I say we have to think historically, okay? The idea, regulated industry has a political problem, right? How credible are tobacco companies? How credible do you think people thought they were in the 1970s? Early 1980s? Not very, to be honest with you, right? What is it? I read some funny comic where one of the characters said together, you know, it's possible that the good people at the American Tobacco Institute might be a little bit biased, okay? Right? So oftentimes, right, regulated industries that introduce products into the stream of commerce that have known public health harms or that are hazardous to public health, they're not considered credible actors, right? And that's a political and social problem for them to advance their agendas. If they really want to get to their aims, the fact that they lack credibility is a serious problem, okay? So, for example, if they go, and I'm aware of what's going on today, but if they go and testify before Congress, for example, okay, right, if they're seen as not credible, right, then that's going to be a problem for them in achieving their regulatory and their political aims. So what do? They purchase credibility. How do they purchase credibility? They purchase credibility by pairing and collaborating and forming relationships with social actors who enjoy high degrees of credibility. Because it's not the Tobacco Institute. They don't enjoy that. But who does enjoy that? It's usually academic scientists, academic physicians, public health professionals, epidemiologists, public health scientists, these people do enjoy social standing. They do enjoy measures of credibility from the public, right? And so there's a very, very old history of industries, regulated industries pairing and collaborating, especially with academic physicians and public health scientists, epidemiologists in particular, right, who enjoy this kind of credibility as a way of arrogating that for themselves. Okay, so this goes back at least to the 1920s. That's when you can find pharmaceutical companies starting to get, and you guys have probably seen this well-known picture, right? More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarettes. Okay, so physicians were a well-known part of the tobacco advertising industry for a variety of reasons and for a very long time. Okay, and that's not accidental, right? This is part of the story. Okay, so moving on to think a little bit about conflicts of interest, and then we'll apply it to issues of collision sports and TBIs. I think it's really helpful to think about this idea of conflicts of interest. This comes from Andrew Stark, who's a political theorist. He doesn't study conflicts of interest in medicine and public health or healthcare, right? But I think that this is a very helpful way of thinking about it. He said that there's 3 stages to motivated bias and conflicts of interest. The first stage is antecedent acts. Right? There's an antecedent act. Antecedent act usually forms a relationship or a partnership. So a team physician or a team, right? A team health professional, an athletic trainer, decides to form a partnership with a tackle football team. That's an antecedent act. It forms a relationship between those 2 parties. That's the first stage. Okay? Usually, when you form relationships and you have good relationships, and I know not all relationships are good ones, but when you have positive relationships, that tends to promote the second stage, which is favorable states of mind, favorable dispositions. When I enter into a relationship with someone and, for example, they bring me what? Lunch is a good example, okay? Or other gifts, or, as we often see with pharmaceutical sales representatives, for example, they are just pleasant. Right? I can't tell you the number of times I've actually had healthcare providers say to me, it's just the best part of my day. Right? You know, they come in and they bring food and they smile, and let's not put too fine a point on it. Pharmaceutical sales representatives tend to be attractive and charismatic. That's not an accident, by the way. Right? And so it feels good, and you have favorable states of mind, favorable dispositions towards people in this position, right? And then the first and the second stage lead to the third stage, which is behavior of partiality. That's the biased behavior. That's what people are trying to avoid. That's usually how this happens, okay? So one of the things you see is that the major strategy that's being used to deal with conflicts of interest, whether we're talking about collision sports or anything else, is what? How should we deal with conflicts of interest? How do we deal with them here? Disclose. We disclose them. So one of my questions for you all, this is something on which I'm actively working, right, is where does disclosure break this chain? It doesn't is the correct answer. It doesn't. It doesn't break any of it. If this is correct, and you don't have to think that it is, but if it is, just presuming for the moment if it is, in order to be an effective remedy against behavior of partiality flowing from these relationships, we would need to break this process somewhere. Disclosure doesn't interfere with the process at all. It just discloses that you have these relationships. That's it, right? You still have favorable states of mind, which can lead to behavior of partiality. One of the important things of understanding about conflicts of interest is that it's iterative. It's not always true that in any given case where a relationship exists, there's going to be behavior of partiality. That's not how it works. What happens is over time, as the relationship goes on, case after case after case after case, it increases the probability that behavior of partiality will flow, okay, and will occur. And empirically, we know this to be true beyond a shadow of a doubt. This is not conjecture. We know this is what happens, okay? When people form tight relationships with members of commercial industry in particular, it is overwhelmingly likely that in the long run, behavior of partiality will ensue. This can take a number of different forms, whether it's biased behavior in how patients, right, or football players are treated, whether it's biased behavior in how research is produced and packaged and interpreted, which we also find with collision sports and tackle football, among other kinds of things. We know that this is more likely to happen, okay? So there's even some evidence that actually disclosure can make things worse, believe it or not. So not only is it ineffective as a remedy, and by the way, don't run out of here saying Goldberg said he shouldn't disclose things, because I'm not saying that. Disclosure's fine. I just don't think it's a very powerful remedy for these kinds of problems. Usually what I say is it's a floor, not a ceiling. Okay, it's not really going to solve our problems. There's some evidence that it can actually make things worse. What does that evidence look like? There's a couple different points to it. The first one is what's called moral license. Sometimes when people disclose the existence of those relationships, they feel pretty good about themselves. If I had suspenders, I'd be going like this. Okay? I feel pretty good about myself because I did my moral duty. I disclosed all my relationships, and now I can go take that trip to Switzerland, right, on the dime of the professional football team or something like that, okay? So it actually can deepen the entanglements that you have because it creates a sense of complacency, right? So that's one way. Another way it happens is there's pretty good evidence, both experimental and natural real-world evidence that actually when an advisor discloses they have a conflict, like to a patient, for example, right, or a player on a football team, it actually paradoxically increases trust in that person. I know it seems counterintuitive, right? Why does that happen? One of the ways that happens is because health professionals, athletic trainers, physicians, healthcare providers in general, right? They often have a degree of social credibility. And so when someone discloses to you as a patient, you feel, wow, this person is really being honest with me. This is a really credible person. I don't want to make them think that I don't trust them, right? Now that they've been so honest with me, so I'm more likely to trust them and actually follow their biased advice. And this has been shown over and over and over again as well, okay? So there's copious evidence that shows effects on prescribing patterns, on all sorts of health professional behaviors, on research behaviors, even after disclosure takes place, okay? So one of the things that I have been arguing is actually what does work, right? If disclosure doesn't work, if it's not, simply about if we have team physicians or team healthcare providers for collision sports teams, tackle football, rugby in Australia, ice hockey in Canada, it's not enough, if we really think this is a serious problem, it's not enough just to have them disclose the existence of those relationships. That's not going to prevent biased behaviors, okay? And just FYI, we have a long history of those behaviors as well, right? I mean, we can go back and start talking about malpractice and negligence suits against team physicians in the NFL. They go back to the early 1970s, right? So there are reasons for that as well. So what does work? If disclosure doesn't work, what does work? The answer is almost the only thing that has been shown to have any impact is what's called sequestration. Right? So sequestration is a legal term. You can think about sequestering juries. It basically means keeping parties apart. Right? If you think about the taxonomy of conflicts of interest that we put up there, you have to prevent the antecedent acts from occurring. How do you prevent the antecedent acts from occurring? No sales reps. No team physicians. No athletic trainers. I know we need athletic trainers. So there are some problems with sequestration as a model. Okay? It presents very, very serious problems. And there's my shameless self-promotion. This is a new paper I have out, sort of documenting all of this kind of stuff. If you're really interested, you can take a look at it. One of the issues is that sequestration, the idea of keeping parties apart, presents a whole lot of serious problems. It's almost certainly not a good idea to avoid having healthcare providers on staff for collision sports. Right? I mean, could you imagine, like, if we had there are high school teams which claim that they can't afford to have athletic trainers? And then the answer would be what? Then you probably shouldn't have a tackle football team, is a good answer, okay? So keeping these things apart is going to be a serious problem. And in some cases may even be a very bad idea, right? So partly one of the things that I've been arguing is, look, there are all sorts of serious problems with how we would even sequester parties, right? Whether it's a good idea. In some contexts, it seems like it might be and it's okay. And in some contexts, it seems like it's not so okay, and I have no idea how we would do it, right? Most of our research infrastructure depends on funding from commercial enterprises. So if we kept them apart, it's unclear what would happen to that. Part of my issue is we spend so much time talking about disclosure, we don't really talk about these kinds of problems, right? There might be answers and ways forward on at least some of them, but if all we talk about when we talk about conflicts of interest is disclosure, then we never get to any actual way of talking about sequestration as a remedy. Okay? And that has been argued. You've actually seen this play out in the public sphere when we start to talk about team physicians in particular and American tackle football. Right? You see the same thing right now, literally going on, literally today, with ice hockey in Canada. Right? So these debates have been going on with tackle football in the U.S. They started earlier here, so probably in the early 1990s, early to mid-1990s. Right? So hockey is probably about 7 to 10 years behind the U.S., and rugby is the other place you're starting to see this really happen in Australasia. And rugby is probably about 10 to 15 years behind the U.S. in terms of the extent of their discourse and conversations on these, but you can see these things over and over again. About there was a professional basketball player last year who sat out the entire season because he did not trust the advice of the team physicians. And he was a very good player, by the way, if you follow basketball. I'm talking about Kawhi Leonard, who is the star player for the San Antonio Spurs. Which has a very good reputation as an organization that takes care of its players, but he wasn't interested. He was not interested in what the team physicians had to say about his health and well-being. So he just declined to play, literally. And it created a big brouhaha for a variety of reasons, okay? But so these kinds of issues they are historic and they are ongoing. And we want to think about what we ought to do about them and how good is it an impact in terms of the health and well-being of people participating in collision sports. And then, sorry, Cindy.
I just had a quick question.
Sure.
Why, because all I know about this is from that movie Concussion, so keeping that in mind,
Sure.
Why was the United States in football first? Or did it start a trend, or just that these things are coming up organically through other means?
That's a really good question, because usually we wouldn't, speaking as a historian, we would not think about the U.S. coming first in terms of its public health interventions, to be honest with you, historically speaking, okay? So why did it come up first? That's a really good question. I think that these issues have been percolating for a long time. Like I said, there were malpractice suits against team physicians starting in the early 1970s. So that's not new. But I think you started to see in the early 1990s, and by the way, I grew up in a football-mad household, just in case anybody wants to know, okay? So American tackle football culture is part of my upbringing. My father is a physician scientist at the University of Miami. So if you know anything about the history of that program in college football, I watched 5 national championships happen in front of me, and I was on the field for 4 of them, actually, right? So a big part of so I think what happened was you just started to see sometimes, I mean, that's when I remember it, and this is me speaking anecdotally, but sometimes you would see the players dealing with these devastating hits. And then there were a series of articles that were published in the early to mid-1990s by a guy named Gene Wojciechowski, who was a senior NFL reporter for ESPN. And he published a series of articles on what was going on with Mike Webster. Mike Webster was a former Hall of Fame center. He plays on the offensive line for American tackle football, and he had a detailed story about what happened to him, which included details like he would have his son tase him into unconsciousness because he couldn't deal with the pain from his headaches. And Mike Webster ended up committing suicide. Right? And I think that this story, partly because it was ESPN, partly because Wojciechowski was a very well-known reporter, it started to really percolate. And then you started to get other football players starting to talk about these things, retired football players in particular. And I think it started to go from there. So I think it was fairly organic. Why they're first versus less in other places, I'm not sure. It might have something to do with the money and the exposure and the sort of the visibility of American tackle football. That's the best I can answer.
Well, and there was also a body of research building at that point. Kevin Guskowitz,
Right.
for one, doing a lot of research on the impact forces in football helmets,
Right.
and that won him a MacArthur Genius Award. So I mean, there was that percolating at the same time.
Yeah. And people had been doing that research for a while, but it was really starting to become more and more pronounced. People started to pay attention to the G-forces that are actually being generated in these kinds of collision sports, right? And starting to understand. And then probably the other thing that's going on is the won't somebody please think about the children phenomenon, right? Because we have 4 million youths and adolescents playing sports. People started to realize that, hey, wait a minute. If this is happening to adults, right, and the epidemiology looks like it has a lot more to do with the persistent accumulation of impacts. Most people think about traumatic brain injury occurring from collision sports from the really violent hit, but actually there's a lot of good evidence in injury epidemiology suggesting that, not that that's a good thing, that can indeed cause serious traumatic brain injury, but that it looks like long-term neuropathology can also be caused by a persistent accumulation of smaller impacts. So for example, if you know anything about how this works in tackle football, what players look like they're at highest risk of developing long-term neuropathology? What position players, for those of you who know anything about tackle football? Most people, when I ask this question, they'll say things like running backs or wide receivers, right? People, offensive players who carry the football and are liable to get these big hits. But actually, that's not true. The positions that are most liable, that look like they're at highest risk for long-term neuropathology, is actually the offensive line, who don't get those big hits. And the reason is because they are always hand-fighting. They smack each other on the head hundreds of times per practice, let alone actual games, okay? And so that looks like that has a lot of what's to do with it as well. So let's skip forward to the second issue, because I want to make sure we have enough time to get to it, and we can talk a little bit more about it. So you can start to see, we are starting to see some momentum for public health interventions that take the forms of laws and policies. So I'm a public health law scholar. I'm interested in ways in which laws and policies can be used to impact population health for good or for ill, and there's evidence that they can do both. Okay, so what are some things we might do aside from sequestration, right, for health professionals in regard to collision sports? So one of the proposals that's starting to gain some momentum is banning tackle football, a complete ban on tackle football under the age of 14, right? So Quebec banned body checking in youth hockey. And if you know anything about ice hockey, Quebec banning body checking would be like Texas banning tackling. It's a big deal, right? So these bills are starting to be introduced. This one was in February, was introduced in Maryland. There was a similar bill that was introduced in Illinois. They did not make it to a vote, but its presenters, its sponsors did not expect to make it to a vote. This was just the beginning, right? They first start with the legislative process by introducing these things. They're going to reintroduce them and reintroduce them. And the hope is that sooner or later, from the sponsors, they will be able to get these things passed. So here's the second ethical problem that I'm interested in. It's this idea of causation, right? Let's go back to the historical script, the manufacture of doubt. How has this worked, right? So opponents of what I'm calling eliminationist policies. Eliminationist policy said, look, we can't make this game safe enough, right? We just can't. There's a lot of people who think we can. Full disclosure, I'm in the camp that says we cannot, okay? We cannot reduce the risk to what I consider to be an acceptable level for youths and adolescents. Adults may be different, but for youths and adolescents, I'm not convinced that we can. But there's a lot of people who think that we can, and that's okay, right? There are other people who are eliminationists. They say, nope, get out, done. No tackle football at all, okay? For kids under the age of 14, 15, whatever it is, 16. Okay? So opponents of these policies, what they will usually argue, and if you're paying attention, you can see this every single day, they will usually say that we have insufficient evidence of causation. The causal evidence just isn't there. We have a given exposure. The exposure here is collision sports, tackle football for youth and adolescents. We have a given harm, which could be neuropathology. And oh, by the way, we're not only, even though today the topic is traumatic brain injury, the health harms we're talking about when we talk about collision sports are not just traumatic brain injury. Right? There are some other very serious harms. Higher risks of chronic pain, inflammatory disease goes way up from participation in collision sports, okay? So it's not just that. But what they say is we have insufficient evidence of causation, and so we shouldn't act until we get better evidence. If you've been paying attention, you know that this is an old technique in the manufacture of doubt. The manufacture of doubt, epistemologically, when we talk about what do we need to know to do something for public health. That's what the manufacture of doubt is really about. It's about doubting what we know, doubting that what we know is enough to generate a regulation, a law, a policy, an approach to dealing with these kinds of problems, right? Here it's a drastic approach, which is saying that kids ought not be able to do it. We should not permit parents to expose their children to this risk, all right? So this technique, I'm saying, well, all we have is correlative evidence. We don't have enough evidence of causation. It's old. It's been wielded many times to great effect to create that regulatory vacuum. And historically, we know that it has been used so well, it has had devastating public health consequences. And the obvious example there is tobacco, right? The tobacco industry didn't deny that there was an association between exposure, tobacco consumption, and adverse health impact. They just claimed that we didn't have enough evidence of causation, right, to be able to really firm up that link and to warrant the kinds of regulatory interventions, okay? So I am interested in this argument for a variety of reasons. I think it's problematic. And the reason I think it's problematic for a number of reasons, the reason I think it's mistaken is because of the precautionary principle, okay? So what's the precautionary principle? The precautionary principle is, and there's been increasing work on this in the last decade. So according to Daniel Steele, who's a philosopher of science, who's written, I think, the best book on the precautionary principle, it's three things all at once. It's a decision rule. It's a rule we can use to make decisions on whether to act. Okay? It is a procedural requirement. We have to have a certain amount of evidence to justify precautionary measures. And it's an epistemic rule. Epistemic rule just means it's a warrant of knowledge. Right? It sets the circumstances, the parameters on when we know enough to be able to take a given public health action. That's what the precautionary principle suggests, okay? So another way of thinking about it is it's been called a form of epistemic crediting. The precautionary principle relaxes the standards of proof required to justify public health action. It says we don't need to know as much as some people might want in order to justify a given public health action. Why not? Okay? So we'll talk about that in one moment. What I have been thinking recently, and I think there's increasing, I don't know if it's consensus, there's increasing agreement about this, that's actually a core justification for public health action of any kind, right? Not just ones applied to collision sports and TBI. Why? Why do I think this is the case? Well, most of our epidemiologic science, our public health science, right, are they randomized controlled trials? Because most people think there are a lot, randomized controlled trials are not the best for everything, so I'm not sitting up here ranting and raving about that, but most people think they're it's a pretty good means of isolating variables and determining whether a given exposure caused a particular outcome, right? We don't do randomized controlled trials very often in epidemiology and public health. Why not? It's unethical in many circumstances. Well, we know benzene is bad for kids, but we don't know the precise levels of benzene exposure that's really going to be bad for kids. So here's what we'll do. We'll set up a placebo arm over here of kids who aren't exposed, and then we'll set up an experimental arm over here with kids, and we'll just expose them to increasing levels of benzene, you see the problem here, until we get to the precise point at which toxicity occurs and public health harm ensues, okay? We can't do those kinds of things, right? So randomized controlled trials in epidemiology are frequently unethical. Number one, what else are they? What's the other reason we don't do them much? Yeah, they're extremely expensive, right? And of course also because exposures to given harms, right, exposures to given products, to given variables, and then harms can sometimes occur decades later, you'd have to have a randomized controlled trial that was longitudinal for 3 decades for some of these kinds of things, right? You can't do that for a variety of reasons. So most of our epidemiology, most of our epidemiologic science is observational. It's cohort studies, right? It's determining correlations. So if we required the kind of strict causal evidence that people in these spaces seem to want, what kinds of public health actions would we have? Yeah, the gentleman back here is shaking his head. That's the right answer. Not much. We wouldn't be able to do a lot, to be honest with you, right? Because we don't have those kinds of causal attributions that people are arguing is what's needed to really justify public health action. So my argument is that that's a totally unreasonable standard for public health action. That's why the precautionary principle exists. We have a large population. This population is particularly vulnerable. Here we're talking about with collision sports and TBI, youths and adolescents. This is a vulnerable population, right? It looks like the injury epidemiology strongly suggests that strapping up pads and running into each other as fast as they can over and over and over again is probably not good for their long-term health, right? The precautionary principle gives us a basis for saying, okay, we are justified in taking some public health action here. We don't need to have the kinds of causal evidence we would ideally love to have. It would be great if we could get it, right? But we're not going to get it because it's largely unethical and it's cost prohibitive in most circumstances. We don't need it, is what the precautionary principle says. We've got enough, right? And that justifies public health actions, okay? So my argument is that when you start to pay attention to this, if this is an issue that interests you and you're looking at what opponents of these eliminationist policies are saying, you will see this. You will see this. And partly my argument is their demands for proofs of causal attributions are unreasonable. And if we applied them across the board, we would have almost no public health actions justified of any kind, because we would require such strict causal standards that epidemiologic science can't meet, really, and has never really been asked to meet. And in fact, epidemiologists don't accept that as a causal warrant as well. There's all sorts of techniques that epidemiologists use to try to justify causal inferences, whether it's multi-level modeling, whether it's the Bradford-Hill criteria, right? There's a whole bunch of things that they use, and the whole idea is, look, these kinds of things justify inferences of causality. Can't be sure. It's not the proof we would like, but they justify an inference sufficient to act. That's what the precautionary principle does. Right? So, of course, there are limits to the precautionary principle, and this is where it gets interesting. Admittedly, it is difficult to specify the scope and the limits of the precautionary principle, right? So if we relax the standards of causal proof that we require to implement precautions or to justify public health action, one of the fair questions is, well, how crappy can your evidence be before you justify public health action, right? So this debate played out, for example, is still playing out, for example, in the soda wars. Right? So what's the evidence, for example, that Mayor Bloomberg, when he was in New York City, what's the evidence that Mayor Bloomberg's regulation that he signed, that he championed, that limits the size of the cups in which you can actually obtain your sugar-sweetened beverage, right? What's the evidence that that has an impact on population health? I'll tell you the answer. It's poor. There's very little evidence of that. Okay, in fact, there's almost no evidence of that. Okay, so how good does your evidence need to be to justify this kind of public health action? And that's a serious question. It's a very serious question, right? It can't just be a get out of public health jail free card, basically, right? It can't just be anything goes. That's probably not a good idea from a public health perspective. So, while I think it's difficult to specify the scope and the limits of the precautionary principle, I actually don't think with sports-related traumatic brain injury, it's a very difficult case. Right? I don't actually think it's that hard, given the evidence that we have of this kind of behavior, this kind of conduct is probably not good, especially if it's persistent and accumulated over time, given the vulnerability of the populations we're discussing. Right? This is not, to me, a borderline case. We've got plenty of evidence from which we can apply the precautionary principle and justify some kind of public health action. Just because we can justify it, by the way, doesn't mean you have to agree with it or think it's the right thing to do. What I'm personally interested in here is that argument from causation, which again is an old argument that's part of the manufacture of doubt. And that argument has historically, again, been used for adverse public health ends. We know that, right? Harms have resulted from that argument. Whether it results from that in this case is a different question. Okay? So one of the other things that I think is really important about the idea of script is sometimes you hear, and I hear this, scientists and epidemiologists who I think are not acting in bad faith, right? So they're not team physicians or team scientists, for example. They don't represent Pop Warner, right, which is the Youth Football League, right, or the National Hockey League or anything like that. They're just completely independent observers. They don't have those relationships that we ought to be concerned with. They look at the evidence, and as any scientist, right, would, or a public health professional would, they look at it and say, you know, this evidence is not as good as I want it to be, right, because reasonable people of good conscience disagree on what the evidence actually suggests. For everybody who works in a scientific or an epidemiological or health professional sphere, that's garden variety everyday stuff. That's normal, right? Part of the problem is, I think, understanding is that move, that argument, that we don't have sufficient causal evidence, regardless of your intention, has very powerful rhetorical and social consequences because of the manufacture of doubt. And that's often very hard for people to understand, right? Even people who are acting in good faith, who are not intending to get the NFL or the NHL off the proverbial hook, right? Who are not intending to cause harm, who have no interest in these regulated industries one way or another, right? People who question this causal link, even if they're doing it in good faith, they need to be aware of the consequences of their actions, which doesn't mean they shouldn't say it, right? If that's what they believe, that's fine if they're acting in good faith. But it also means that there are social and political consequences from that you only understand once you start to understand the manufacture of doubt and these historical scripts. And I think it's really important for people who are engaged in these debates to understand the consequences of what they're doing, even when they're acting in good faith. As we know from the material on conflicts of interest, many of them think they're acting in good faith, but they may not be. Okay? So that's it. I'm going to stop there, and we have about 10 minutes for further questions and discussion. So thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate it. So please feel free.
So how would you counter then the arguments, well, football is so important to our culture, it gives poor kids opportunities for jobs later on. So, how do you counteract that?
Yeah, I see. Well, football's deep play, number one, right? So it's hard. And in fact, what you really start to see, I think there's been an interesting variation on that theme, Carol, which is because we have, and I haven't talked about it in this, although I have other material where I do, we have such stark racial demographics in participation of American tackle football in the U.S. in particular, right? Starkly, overwhelming, disproportionately people of color, African Americans in particular, play American tackle football. As you go higher up, it even gets starker and starker in terms of those differences. We know we already have significant population-based inequalities in traumatic brain injury, and they are racial and ethnic. Largely, we think that's because of injury and violence exposures of different kinds that people of color are at higher rates of experiencing. But you can start to see the problem. If we have millions of people playing tackle football, and we already have existing inequalities, right, we could be expanding them, which most ethicists think is probably not what we want to be doing, is expanding racial health inequalities in the U.S., okay? So one of the things that has happened is, for example, that state of Maryland, when we proposed that eliminationist public health policy, where did they get pushback from? Well, a number of different communities, but actually one of them was from people of color. Right? There were African American communities in Maryland who basically stood up and said, you guys have taken away so much from us historically. This is really important to our culture and our communities and our families. This is what we do. This is deepest play. They didn't say that, but that's what I would say. It's not just deep play, it's deepest play, right? You're not going to take this away from us too. Which actually, that's a hard thing to respond to be honest with you. There's a bit too much of public, I'm not opposed to public health paternalism in general. I think public health is paternalistic, and I don't have a problem with that personally. But there is a long history of overreach in the name of public health, and that's problematic as well. And I think it's problematic to go to communities, especially marginalized and disadvantaged communities, and tell them that we know what's better for your health than you do. Right? When they're telling us something is really important to their lives and their communities, and we're sort of not listening, and just saying, well, you can't do it anymore. Too bad, so sad, bye-bye. That's not something I'm really comfortable with, right? So what do you say in response? I'm not sure. There may not be something that is effective in responding to that community, right? I think, telling people, as I think most people know, telling people that things are bad for them is not a good health promotion strategy, as it turns out. It would be nice if it was, telling people that vaccines are good for you and you should probably not avoid vaccinating your child. That is not a very effective technique, as it turns out, in increasing vaccination uptake. There are some things that are, but just telling people the public health facts is not a good method of health promotion, right? So, detailing the epidemiology and the risks for these communities is probably not going to be very effective, to be honest with you. So I think one of the only things you can say is, look, it's not like this is being taken away from ever, we're just delaying it, right? It seems like it's a bit risky at this point in time. And so the idea is we want to wait. And by the way, that age of 14 is a pretty arbitrary cutoff as well. There are some reasons why they do it. But if football is safe if it's unsafe at 13, it's not clear why it's safe at 14. Or 15, or even 16 for that matter. So that's the argument that has been tried to be used, is look, there are still ways of practicing football. And then there are actually some coaches who are on board with it. And what they have tried to tell communities is, look, we have no evidence that if you don't start playing tackle football before 14 or 15, that you're actually disadvantaged in terms of if you were one of the lucky few who actually could make a career out of this collision sport. Right? There's no evidence to suggest that if you pick up tackle football at 15, as opposed to 8, where oftentimes they start, right, that will dramatically impact their chances of long-term success. And there are actually some coaches who think that that's not true. So that's also what's been tried to be said. Look, you can play other kinds of, you can play flag football, which is not the same as tackle football, but you can play other kinds of things and develop some skills when you're 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and you can start playing tackle later. But it may not fly, to be honest with you, girl. Hey, Cynthia.
I had a question about, I'm thinking about one of your previous lectures about how good public health policy is enforceable, and this is a circumstance in which we literally have a ref and there's literally a person to enforce it. Thinking about the mitigating factor, like to not do the full tackles, like if there was another kind of football, like flag football or two-hand touch or something, to not do the full tackles. Are there groups of people who want 8 to 14-year-olds doing the full tackles? Like, where is the pushback coming from?
Oh yeah, there's tons, right? There's actually tons of them. So there's actually an organization which is starting to gain. You can call it's called Save Youth Football. They're based in California. I'm not joking, right? So they're starting to become pretty active, and they're not the only one. There are others. Football is deep play, right? You hear lots of coaches and families and communities say this is good. This is good for our children. We want them to be able to do that, right? Some of the arguments I think in favor of these things are beyond asinine. Okay, like saying things like, well, we have such a problem with people being sedentary in this country. As if the only choices are to play a collision sport or to be sedentary. There are other things that can be done, I think, that pose smaller risks of long-term neuropathology than a collision sport, right? But so yeah, there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of people who think that that football is really important, and of course this is deeply steeped in all sorts of cultures of toxic masculinity and other kinds of things which is going on, right? And militarism. is also a part of this when we start to talk about tackle football. There was a coach of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the football team, about 6 weeks ago. There was a big ESPN article on him. You can Google it. It was mind-blowing to me as a scholar on this, right? Where he basically said that he'd had a conversation with a 3-star general, and the general had told him that the reason the U.S. had been so successful in its military triumphs in the past was because of football. So there's a lot of pushbacks in there.
That's where it's coming from.
Yeah, so it's easy for somebody like me who's not a football fan to say, and just sort of being, having a passing knowledge of epidemiology, to say, well, and a passing knowledge of the history of tobacco and coal mining and so forth, to say, well, precautionary principle is, should be given the benefit of the doubt, when the arguments line up. But just for perspective, can you give me some examples of, you alluded to, there are also examples of overreach or where there was actually harm done?
Yeah, so here's where Steele talks about this, Eric, which I think is interesting. He has this. He says history of public health is actually matters to the moral argument. He's making moral arguments, basically. He's not a historian, right? But he's saying, and the reason is because if the application of a generous precautionary principle resulted in a whole bunch of harm, history should tell us that. We should be able to see those pretty clearly where, gee, that was a bad idea, as it turns out. Taking that action was a terrible idea. And he says the balance of history does not have a lot of examples where that's the case, right? Where specifically because we had a generous interpretation of the precautionary principle, we did bad things, right? I think, speaking as a historian, and I'm biased, but speaking as a historian, I think he's largely right about that. We have, unfortunately, this goes more to your question, however, a lot of examples of public health actors behaving in very inappropriate ways. I'm not sure it's because of the precautionary principle. That's what I was about to say, right? Public health in general, public health action usually is state action. Sometimes there are private actors involved in public health, but public health usually has to involve, it's usually collective, right? So when we're talking about collective action, you have to usually have some kind of state or government involvement at some level, right? And when you do that, there are substantial risks that are involved. The most obvious example in the history of American public health is eugenics. Right? Eugenics, most people know the history of eugenics, but it was extremely popular, and it was really fairly called a public health movement, I think, in many ways, in the U.S. for certain, right? And it has resulted in untold harms being done to the most vulnerable people, some of the most vulnerable people in the history, right? So the risk of governmental overreach in the name of public health is a very real one. I don't think it's because of the precautionary principle. I think it has something more to do.
That was like junk science.
Well, but they didn't think it was junk science at the time. That's the trick. They thought it was the elite health professionals who thought that eugenics had merit, right? And so that's always the trick, is we look back and say, well, we're a lot smarter than they were. We're not going to do those kinds of things. And of course, people 60, 70, 80 years from now will probably look at us and be like, what are you people doing, right? So those risks are very real. I don't think they're as much driven by the precautionary principle. I think they adhere in the name of public health in general, right? For someone on the other side of this, they would have to come back to me and explain how keeping kids from playing collision sports until they reach the age of 16 or 17 would be really bad for them. And like I said in response to Cynthia, you hear some of those arguments, but maybe they are convincing to you, but most of them are absolutely bananas to me, to be honest with you, because I'm all for encouraging physical activity. That sounds like a good idea. There are a whole bunch of different kinds of physical activities which seem like they have much lower risk profiles of long-term illness and injury than 10-year-olds playing collision sports, right? So usually that's what I say is, find something else to do. You don't have to do tackle football or ice hockey or rugby. Terry, you got a question? I know we're almost out of time, but go ahead.
Well, just the gender lens on this I think is so interesting, and I was just thinking how much of this is filtered through the desire to protect girls being different than boys? And if girls played football, do you think we'd be having a different conversation?
Well, and actually what's really interesting, and I'm sure you know this, right, the injury epidemiology suggests that youth and adolescent girls are actually at higher risk of most kinds of injuries, not necessarily TBI, but most kinds of injuries that results from participation in sports. And here I'm not just talking about collegiate sports. Sports writ large is actually girls. And girls look like they're at substantially higher risk of knee injuries. And I think TBI is actually true as well. I think they are at higher risk of TBI. So I think this has everything to do with toxic masculinity. There's no question about that. When we start to talk about deep play games in particular, right? I mean, most societies are affected by these kinds of patriarchal structures. So if our deep play games usually reflect that, right? And that's true in most places. It's certainly true of ice hockey in Canada. It's true of rugby and Australian football and Australasia, right? So I think a lot of this has to do with our gender ideas in general, right? You know, what's interesting is the sport that has the highest risk of TBI. So tackle football is one of them, but what are the other ones in the U.S.? So cheerleading, which is gendered strongly female, cheerleading has a very high risk of TBI. The prevalence of the injury is low, but when the injuries happen in cheerleading, they tend to be catastrophic. There's much higher likelihood that they're catastrophic for, I think, pretty obvious reasons if you think about it, right?
And the rate per hour of exposure.
Right, the rate per hour exposure. So there are people working on this, is what I'd say, Sarah. But I think it probably doesn't occupy the that sort of attention. Frankly, because it's highly gendered, and also because they're not deep play games, which is another way of saying they're highly gendered, right? So, but yeah, there are huge gender issues lurking here. And like I said, I sort of see it having a lot to do with toxic masculinity. Right? I mean, that's what it means to be a young man, and you hear people saying this all the time, which goes to Cynthia's question about why do people do this, right? I mean, one of the most important ethical questions, and this will be the last thing to say because I know we're out of time, that is sort of underlying all of this is what level of risk should we as a society allow parents to expose their children to? And that's actually that's a moral question. We can have great epidemiology, but no epidemiology is going to answer that question. It can only help us. It can help us decide it, but there's no answer that epidemiology is going to give. That's a moral and a social and a political question, and it's actually difficult. And I think it's one on which, even though I have strong feelings, it's one on which reasonable people can disagree. We live in Colorado. We let our kids do what? Ski. Okay, the rate of injury from skiing is not negligible, to be honest with you. Right? Or I think, because I'm a public health person, the riskiest thing, the thing I cannot believe that we let 16-year-old boys, and I do mean boys here, okay? Yeah, 16-year-old boys, by the numbers, that's the riskiest thing most people who live in the first world will ever do, ever, is get behind the wheel of a car. And we let 16-year-old boys do it.
And we let 12-year-olds have shotguns.
We let 12-year-olds have shotguns. So in the U.S., we let parents have a lot of latitude about the risks to which they are willing to expose their children. So even if you think all of this is true, someone might say, I think this is an acceptable risk for parents to expose their children to. I don't personally agree with that, but that's not an unreasonable claim. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Dad.